Hey guys, tonight we begin with the strange and occasionally ridiculous punishments handed out in medieval Europe, a time when justice was creative, law was flexible, and most legal precedents were made up on the spot by a guy with a funny hat. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you think your worst hangover story is bad, imagine it ending with you stuck inside a beer barrel while your neighbours laugh and throw turnips at you. Welcome to medieval Europe's drunkard's cloak, the one fashion statement guaranteed to ruin both your dignity and your posture. Here's how it worked. You got drunk. And not the charming singing songs with friends kind of drunk. More like trying to wrestle a church bell drunk. Maybe you serenaded the town fountain. Maybe you fell asleep face down in a pigsty. Whatever your personal masterpiece of bad judgment was, the local authorities decided you needed to learn a lesson. That lesson came in the form of a large wooden barrel with holes cut in it. One for your head, two for your arms. You were shoved inside and suddenly you weren't a person anymore. You were a walking keg of shame. And then came the parade. Picture it. You, waddling awkwardly through cobbled streets, every step accompanied by the squeak of wood and the faint aroma of whatever that barrel held last. Could be wine, could be salted fish. The point was to make you memorable, and they succeeded. People followed you, jeering and tossing vegetable scraps. The local gossip got fresh material, the children learned the valuable lesson that adults can be idiots, and you learned that oak is surprisingly heavy. In some German towns, they called it the barrel pillory, and used it not just for drunks, but also for petty thieves and compulsive gossipers. It was the medieval version of wearing a sign that says, "I made bad choices," only heavier and harder to wash. And here's the thing, this was considered merciful. No one was breaking bones, branding skin, or dunking you in a river. You just had to endure a slow, humiliating shuffle while looking like the world's saddest wine cask. In the hierarchy of medieval justice, that's practically a spa day. Still, you had to ask yourself, was the night worth it? The answer, given the look on the average drunkard's cloak victim's face, was always the same. A deep, silent regret, and maybe a sudden craving for water. If the drunkard's cloak was medieval Europe's walk of shame, the cucking stool was its sit-and-splash version. This was the punishment for scolds, a term that covered women accused of nagging, gossiping, or just generally being inconvenient to men in positions of authority. In other words, your crime could range from starting an actual riot to pointing out that the baker's bread was stale. The setup was simple. A sturdy wooden chair, sometimes just a crude bench, was attached to the end of a long beam or suspended above water. You were strapped into it, paraded through the streets so the crowd could work up some enthusiasm, and then dunked. And not just once. You'd be plunged into a river, pond, or whatever water source the town had handy. Some were lucky enough to be dunked in relatively clean water. Others got the local sewage channel. If you think that's bad, remember, this was before antibiotics. You weren't just being humiliated, you were being introduced to medieval dysentery. The dunking wasn't technically meant to kill you. It was about cooling your temper, which is adorable medieval code for publicly break your spirit. Each dip was supposed to make you calmer, wetter, and hopefully less inclined to sass your neighbours in the future. Men weren't immune either. Fraudsters, cheats, and liars could also find themselves in the chair, usually to the delight of the townsfolk. If your crime involved money, someone would almost certainly be shouting, "Hope you can swim in debt," from the shore. Some towns got extra creative. The chair could be wheeled around on land first, just to build suspense, or the beam could be swung in such a way that the victim got half dunked, leaving them sputtering with one side of their body soaked while the crowd debated whether to finish the job. And here's the kicker. The word cuck in cucking stool didn't originally mean what it does today. It came from cucken, meaning to defecate. So yes, the name literally translates to poop chair, which, given the quality of some medieval rivers, was disturbingly accurate. So, you'd get strapped in, dunked until the crowd was satisfied, and then hauled out, dripping, shivering, and probably reconsidering your approach to small-town politics. Medieval justice. Because sometimes humiliation works better with a bucket of cold water. If the medieval world had an X factor, the shame flute was its rejection buzzer. Officially called the flute of shame, it was a punishment for bad musicians, public disturbers, or anyone who'd been a little too loud for the town's liking. The device itself looked like an oversized, clunky metal recorder, except it didn't actually make music. It was more like a trombone, and a neck brace had a terrible child. The flute was locked around your neck, your hands were shackled in place as if you were playing it, and then you were sent out in public to perform for everyone who already hated your sound. You couldn't really move your arms, you couldn't put the thing down, and it was made of metal, which meant it was heavy, awkward, and would leave you with some impressive bruises. The message was clear. You've annoyed us enough. Now we'll annoy you back. This wasn't just for musicians who made ears bleed. In some towns, they used the shame flute for people accused of drunken shouting, spreading rumours, or just making too much noise after curfew. Basically, if you made sound waves the mayor didn't approve of, you were getting a front row seat in this one-man band of humiliation. The punishment relied on pure embarrassment. You were paraded through the streets while everyone pretended to enjoy your concert. Children pointed, drunks laughed, and people made sarcastic requests like, "Play the one about the miller's daughter." Even the local dogs seemed to judge you. If you tried to talk, your voice echoed awkwardly inside the tube, making you sound even more ridiculous. And if you thought you could play something decent to redeem yourself, think again. The flute wasn't built to work. It was essentially a mute prop, the medieval equivalent of handing a terrible chef a plastic spatula and telling him to cook for the crowd. The whole thing could last for hours, depending on the severity of your noise crime. When it was finally over, you'd walk home with a sore neck, aching arms, and the knowledge that for the rest of your life, you'd be that guy with the fake flute. Medieval moral of the story: don't play your lute badly, or worse, your bagpipes. The townsfolk might just give you a new instrument you'll never forget. If medieval Europe had a customer service department, the Branks bridle would have been their mute button. This punishment was designed for scolds, people, usually women, accused of gossiping, nagging, or generally talking too much for someone else's liking. And by liking, I mean the local magistrate who really didn't want to hear about his bread prices being unfair again. The Branks bridle was essentially a metal cage that fit over the entire head. Imagine a helmet, but instead of protecting you from injury, it was designed to make you look like you'd lost a bet with a blacksmith. The pièce de résistance was a flat, spiked plate that rested inside your mouth, pressing down on the tongue. This meant that not only could you not speak, but trying to do so was an express ticket to stabbing your own tongue. The effect was striking. From a distance, you looked like an escapee from a very niche medieval parade. Up close, it was clear that someone, somewhere, had spent far too much time thinking about how to silence you in the most humiliating way possible. The wearer would be marched through the streets so that everyone could admire the latest in spring torture wear. The whole point was public humiliation, to make your neighbours see you as an object of ridicule rather than a human being with opinions about the price of fish. Sometimes, the bridle came with extra decorations, bells, horns, or even little animal shapes welded on. These weren't for flair. They were to draw more attention so that the punishment worked as a community event. Because nothing says justice like making sure everyone stops what they're doing to watch Martha from down the lane drool into the dirt. Was it effective? In the short term, yes. You physically couldn't speak. In the long term, probably not. If anything, it just gave people more gossip material. Did you see her in the bridal yesterday? Quickly became a bigger topic than whatever started the whole mess. Removing the bridle didn't end the humiliation. Word travelled fast in small towns, and for months afterward, you'd be the one who had to wear that thing. So, the moral of the story? In medieval Europe, keeping your mouth shut wasn't just polite. It could save you from wearing the world's most uncomfortable conversation starter. In medieval Europe, if you were accused of a crime and there wasn't enough evidence, you didn't get a lawyer, a jury, or a fair trial. You got an ordeal. The logic was simple. If you were innocent, God would protect you. If you were guilty, well, hope you enjoyed your last meal. One common ordeal was the boiling water test. Your hand was plunged into a cauldron of scalding water to retrieve a stone from the bottom. Then it was wrapped up and left for 3 days. If the wound looked miraculously healed when unwrapped, you were declared innocent. If it was festering, which shockingly it often was, you were guilty. Another favourite was the red-hot iron test. You'd carry a glowing hot metal bar for a few steps. The healing inspection worked the same way, and so did the results. It's almost as if burning human flesh doesn't heal neatly in 3 days. Who knew? Then there was trial by cold water. You'd be tied up and thrown into a river or lake. Floating meant you were guilty. The water was rejecting you. Sinking meant innocence, because apparently drowning was the mark of a pure soul. The flaw in this system was obvious. Even if you passed, you were still dead. Congratulations. These trials weren't reserved for minor crimes. Theft, witchcraft, heresy, all could earn you a spot in the Let's See What Happens games. And the best part? The people supervising the ordeal were usually the same ones who already suspected you, which made it a bit like asking your executioner to hold your parachute. To make matters worse, surviving an ordeal didn't always end things. People might still suspect you, because clearly you'd gotten help from dark forces. So you could pass the test and still end up in another form of medieval entertainment, like the pillory or worse. On paper, trial by ordeal was about divine justice. In practice, it was about spectacle, intimidation, and a good excuse to avoid doing any actual investigation. Why bother with evidence when you can just boil someone's hand and call it God's will? So if you were a medieval villager accused of something you didn't do, you prayed for a miracle, or at least for a judge with a better idea of justice than, let's set them on fire and see what happens. If medieval Europe had a town square attraction, it wasn't a fountain or a statue, it was the pillory. Think of it as the medieval community bulletin board, except instead of posting announcements, you posted yourself. The pillory was a sturdy wooden frame with holes for your head and hands. Once you were locked in, you weren't going anywhere until the local authorities decided you'd been humiliated enough. And by humiliated enough, they usually meant long enough for every person you've ever annoyed to walk past and laugh at you. Crimes that could land you here ranged from fraud to cheating at the market, to insulting an official, which basically meant telling the mayor his hat looked stupid. Once in place, you were exposed to whatever the public felt like dishing out. Rotten vegetables, mud, insults, the occasional dead animal part. And yes, pigeons. Pigeons loved the pillory. The beam you were locked into was perfect for perching, and let's just say they didn't hold back their opinions. The idea wasn't to physically harm you, though bruises and the odd black eye were common, but to destroy your reputation. You became a living spectacle. Kids would tug their parents' sleeves to see the bad man in the wood, and those parents would take the opportunity to loudly announce what you'd done, just in case anyone missed the gossip. The real challenge was time. You could be stuck in the pillory for hours, even days. Standing with your neck bent forward, your hands trapped, and the sun, or rain, beating down on you, was exhausting. And there was no bathroom break, which made longer sentences. Awkward. Occasionally, the crowd got creative. They might hang signs around your neck announcing your crime in verse, or dress you in ridiculous clothing before locking you in. Some towns even kept a punishment wardrobe for just such occasions, proving that medieval justice had a sense of theatre. The pillory eventually fell out of favour in the 19th century, partly because it was considered cruel, and partly because people started to enjoy it too much. When the crowd's laughter turns into an impromptu tomato-throwing competition, the line between justice and free entertainment gets blurry fast. Still, for centuries, the pillory stood as a reminder. In a small medieval town, your worst nightmare wasn't prison. It was standing still while everyone else got to comment on your life choices. If medieval Europe loved anything, it was multitasking. Why punish someone and throw a festival when you could just combine the two? Enter the whipping carousel, a public punishment that turned humiliation into a group activity. Picture this. The offender is tied to a large wooden post or strapped into a moving platform, and instead of a quiet, efficient lashing, the punishment is done in full view of an excited crowd. But here's the twist. The carousel part wasn't for decoration. The device actually spun, slowly turning the victim so everyone in the square could get a good look, like a very sad rotisserie chicken. This served two purposes. Equal viewing angles, because justice demanded that no villager be robbed of their turn to stare and jeer. Efficient whipping. As the offender rotated, the appointed lash wielder didn't even have to move much. Just stand there and let the person come to you, which frankly is a level of workplace convenience rare in the Middle Ages. Crimes that could earn you a ride on the whipping carousel ranged from theft and fraud to public blasphemy. Or, in some places, just being on the losing side of local politics. And while it was definitely painful, the humiliation was the real point. Your neighbours didn't just hear about your crime. They saw your grimacing, spinning face as you took each lash. Of course, the crowd played their part. They'd cheer, boo, and sometimes throw things between rotations. It wasn't enough for you to be punished. You had to be entertaining. And nothing says fun Saturday outing like bringing the kids to see Uncle Gerard get spun and smacked because he tried to cheat the miller. The length of the punishment varied. A minor theft might get you a few turns. A bigger offence could see you spinning until you were dizzy, sore, and wondering if repentance also came with motion sickness. Eventually, devices like this faded out, replaced by more civilized forms of justice, though some towns probably missed the sheer community spirit of watching someone go around like a medieval game show prize. If there's one takeaway here, it's this. In medieval Europe, your shame wasn't private. It was rotated, displayed, and given full audience participation. If you've ever sat on an uncomfortable chair, multiply that by 100, add public humiliation, and you've got the medieval wooden donkey. The donkey wasn't an actual animal, though that would have been both kinder and more entertaining. It was a long, narrow wooden beam with a sharp, angled top, basically a torture device disguised as furniture. Offenders were forced to sit astride it, legs hanging on either side, as if riding a horse, if that horse was carved from misery and designed by someone who hated you personally. To make things worse, the victim was often weighted down. Heavy stones or iron weights were tied to their feet, increasing the pressure on a spot that nature did not design for prolonged sitting. And because medieval Europe was all about presentation, the whole setup was usually in the middle of a busy square. You didn't suffer alone. You suffered with an audience. The crimes that could earn you a seat on the donkey varied. Soldiers caught misbehaving, townsfolk guilty of indecent conduct, and sometimes even women accused of loose morals were prime candidates. The punishment wasn't just about pain, it was about making you look ridiculous. The crowd loved it. They'd jeer, laugh, and sometimes bring children to watch, because apparently medieval parenting involved showing kids what happens when you cross the wrong blacksmith's wife. If the offender yelped or shifted uncomfortably, the laughter doubled. After all, the entire point was to turn suffering into public entertainment. The length of time spent on the donkey depended on the severity of the offence and the cruelty of the authorities. A few hours could leave lasting injuries. Longer sentences risked permanent damage. But hey, at least it taught you to respect local laws and invest in softer seating. Some towns even added decorations, like painting the donkey bright colours or giving it a carved head and tail. Because if you're going to ruin someone's day, why not do it with style? In the end, the wooden donkey was proof that medieval punishments didn't just aim to hurt. They aimed to humiliate, degrade, and make you part of the day's entertainment schedule. You weren't just paying for your crime, you were the star of the show. If medieval punishments could win awards for creativity and cruelty, Poena Cule would be up there with a standing ovation. The name is Latin for penalty of the sack, and it was exactly that. You, a sack, and some very unfortunate company. Originally a Roman punishment for parricide, killing your father, mother, or close family member. It stuck around in parts of medieval Europe because apparently no one looked at it and thought, this is a bit much. The process went like this. The convicted person was sewn into a large leather sack along with a rooster, a dog, a snake, and a monkey. Yes, you heard that right. A mini medieval zoo of absolute chaos. The idea wasn't just to execute you, it was to terrify you with every bite, scratch, and hiss possible before you even hit the water. Because yes, once everyone was inside the sack, you were thrown into a river or the sea. If drowning didn't get you first, panic from the feathered, furry, and scaly death squad surely would. Why those animals? Symbolism. The dog represented loyalty betrayed, the rooster vigilance ignored, the snake treachery, and the monkey. Honestly, historians still debate that one. My personal theory? Someone just really hated monkeys. Medieval authorities claimed the point was moral justice. You'd committed a crime against your own blood, so now you'd be trapped with creatures you couldn't reason with, in a dark space you couldn't escape. But let's be honest, it was also designed to make everyone in town talk about it for years afterward. If they couldn't find one of the animals, monkeys weren't exactly native to most of Europe. Substitutions were made. Cats, geese, or whatever could be found that was likely to panic in a sack. Which means you could commit the same crime in 2 different towns and end up with wildly different last moments. This was a rare punishment, but when it happened, it left a mark, not just on the victim and the animals, but on the spectators who got to witness one of the most bizarre and disturbing executions in history. It's the kind of medieval justice that makes you wonder, were they trying to punish the guilty, or audition for the world's darkest travelling circus? In the grand gallery of medieval punishments, the breaking wheel wins for looking deceptively simple. It was, quite literally, a huge wooden wheel, the kind you might see on a cart. Except this one didn't roll you to market. It rolled you straight into the history books of, please never again. The wheel was laid flat or mounted upright, and the condemned was positioned across it. The real magic of this device was its public setting, smack in the middle of a square or open field, because if there was one thing medieval Europe loved, it was turning justice into a neighbourhood event. Depending on the crime, the punishment could involve a series of strikes meant to, well, let's just say disable the offender's ability to move for the rest of their life. For a more merciful version, some were tied to the wheel and displayed without further injury, left for hours or days to let shame, weather, and hunger do the work. Why use a wheel? Practicality. It was sturdy, easy to rotate for public viewing, and had the added effect of making the condemned look like part of some strange medieval art installation. Children probably asked their parents, "Why is that man on a wagon wheel?" and got answers like, "Because he stole bread," which must have made for interesting family discussions at dinner. The breaking wheel was meant for big crimes, serious theft, rebellion, and other acts the authorities wanted to make examples of. The bigger the crime, the bigger the crowd, and the longer the display. Some towns got theatrical about it, decorating the wheel with banners or posting the person's crime in big letters, so everyone knew exactly why they were there. In rare cases, an offender might be tied up and spun for dramatic effect, because nothing says deterrent like looking like a slow-moving fairground ride from the 8th circle of hell. Eventually, the breaking wheel fell out of fashion, partly because laws evolved, and partly because the sheer logistics of wheeling this thing out for every big offence became a bit much. Still, it left behind a legacy. Proof that in medieval Europe, even a common wagon wheel could be turned into a tool for public order and public spectacle. If the pillory was medieval Europe's way of making you stand still for your public shame, Whipping at the cart's tail was the opposite. It brought the punishment to the people. Think of it as the delivery service of humiliation. Here's how it worked. The offender was tied to the back of a cart and whipped as it was driven slowly through the streets. Not in some hidden alley. No, right down the main thoroughfare where every neighbour, friend and distant cousin could get a good look. If you were lucky, the cart moved at a walking pace. If you weren't, it was a brisk trot, which meant you got the added joy of stumbling to keep up while tied to a moving vehicle. The crimes for this mobile justice varied. Petty theft, public disorder, slander, and general annoying the wrong official could all earn you a ticket to this travelling embarrassment. The goal wasn't just to punish you physically, it was to make sure everyone saw it happen. A stationary humiliation could only reach so many people. This way, the authorities could tour you like a cautionary tale on wheels. The crowd participation was, of course, encouraged. People would jeer, throw whatever was on hand, vegetable scraps, mud, or the occasional insult so creative it probably deserved its own award. The punishment wasn't over until the cart had made its full route, which might loop through the busiest parts of town multiple times. The cart itself wasn't decorated. This wasn't a parade float. But the driver played an important role. They set the pace, and a too cheerful driver could make your life significantly worse by hitting every bump in the road. Medieval cobblestones were not known for their smooth ride. Despite its simplicity, whipping at the cart's tail had staying power. It was cheap, required no special equipment beyond a cart and some rope, and guaranteed maximum exposure for your misdeeds. If a warning to the public was the aim, this was as efficient as it got. Eventually, it faded out as justice systems became less about public theatre and more about closed-door decisions. But for centuries, if you saw a cart rolling slowly through town with someone tied to it, you knew the show was about to start. In the fashion world, some accessories say elegance, others say rebellion, and the iron collar said, "I've made a terrible life choice." This wasn't jewellery in the usual sense. The iron collar was a thick metal ring locked around the offender's neck, often with a chain attaching it to a post or wall. In some cases, the chain was short, keeping you in one spot like a very sad lawn ornament. In others, there was no chain at all. You were just stuck wearing it as a walking announcement of your crime. The collar wasn't subtle. It was heavy, uncomfortable, and deliberately obvious. Many had inscriptions or engravings explaining your offence: thief, liar, or my personal favourite, gossiper. Imagine trying to buy bread while literally wearing a sign around your neck that says, "Don't trust me." Subtle social cue there. Crimes that earned you this medieval bling were usually in the embarrass, don't execute category. Petty theft, slander, cheating at market weights. Sometimes it was combined with other punishments, like standing in the town square for a few hours so everyone could read your new accessory and commit it to memory. The real genius of the iron collar was its longevity. In some cases, it wasn't just for an afternoon. You could be forced to wear it for days or even weeks, making sleeping, eating, and general existing an ongoing exercise in discomfort. And of course, you couldn't take it off yourself. That required a blacksmith, and the permission of the very people who put it on you. In some towns, the collar was permanently fixed to a wall or the side of a building, and the offender had to stand there until their time was up. This turned the punishment into a sort of living billboard. Come to the market, and while you're here, look at this guy who tried to shortchange the baker. Eventually, the iron collar fell out of fashion, partly because attitudes toward public humiliation changed, and partly because iron isn't cheap, and using it for neck decor stopped being worth the trouble. Still, for its time, it was an efficient little device. Portable shame, low maintenance, and guaranteed to make you the least popular person at any medieval dinner party. Medieval Europe had a very straightforward approach to crime prevention. If you stole something with your hand, well, you might not be using that hand again. Amputation for theft was exactly what it sounded like. The removal of a hand, finger, or sometimes even a foot if you were particularly bad at shoplifting. The idea was simple. Take away the tools of the crime, and the problem solves itself. Brutal? Yes. Effective? Also yes. But mostly because it scared everyone else into keeping their hands firmly in their own pockets. This punishment wasn't for every stolen loaf of bread. At least, not everywhere. In some towns, petty theft got you fines or public shaming, but repeated offenders, or those caught stealing valuable goods, risked the one-and-done policy. If the local lord wanted to make an example of you, the sentence could be carried out in the town square for maximum impact. Nothing says "don't steal" like watching someone instantly lose their career in pickpocketing. The execution of the sentence, pun fully intended, varied. Some used an axe, others a sword, and in rare cases a chisel and mallet. Because why not add carpentry vibes to your legal system? Officials often had a specialist carry it out, not just to ensure it was done cleanly, but because nobody wanted to explain to their spouse why they were covered in blood after market day. Of course, the punishment was as much about social consequences as physical ones. Losing a hand in a society built on manual labour didn't just limit your job prospects, it marked you for life. Everyone could see what you'd done, and even if you claimed it was an accident with a millstone, people probably weren't buying it. There's also the deterrent factor. A thief might have skill, stealth, and charm, but it's hard to pick a pocket with one hand, and harder still when everyone in town knows exactly why you have one hand. Over time, laws across Europe softened, replacing amputation with prison or exile. But for centuries, it was a favourite tool in the justice toolbox, a way to handle theft in one decisive, irreversible step. It was quick, it was clear, and it made medieval law enforcement the original inventors of the zero-tolerance policy. In medieval Europe, if you couldn't be punished forever, your reputation certainly could be. Branding was the art of turning your skin into a permanent criminal record. No paperwork required. The process was simple in theory, if unpleasant in execution. A heated iron stamp was pressed into the skin, leaving a scar in the shape of a letter or symbol that announced your crime to the world. T for thief, F for forger, V for vagrant, though in some places they preferred little pictures instead of letters. Imagine strolling into town with a small permanent icon on your forehead that basically says, "Ask me about my bad life choices." Branding wasn't always done on the face. Hands, shoulders, or other visible spots worked too. The key was visibility. This wasn't about quietly correcting behaviour. It was about turning you into a walking cautionary tale. Even if you swore you'd changed your ways, the mark told everyone not to trust you, or at least not to leave you alone with the silverware. The crimes that could earn a brand ranged from petty theft to fraud, desertion, or breaking curfew in particularly strict towns. In some regions, branding was a graduated punishment. The first offence might get you a fine, the second a few hours in the stocks, and the third? Congratulations, you've just been upgraded to a human billboard. It wasn't just about shame, though. Branding made it easy for law enforcement to spot repeat offenders, especially in a time before ID cards or mugshots. Authorities could look at you and immediately know your criminal history, like an early painful version of carrying your rap sheet in your wallet. The branding iron itself varied by region. Some were small and elegant, well, as elegant as branding gets, while others were big enough to make the punishment visible from across the market square. And because medieval towns had a flair for public spectacle, the branding often happened in the square, with the whole community watching. Nothing says, "stay out of trouble," like watching your neighbour get their skin permanently engraved. Over time, branding fell out of favour as justice systems evolved, but its legacy stuck, literally. In the Middle Ages, you could change your clothes, move to another town, even grow a beard, but the mark stayed. Justice, medieval style, meant you didn't just serve your sentence, you wore it. If medieval Europe had a premium package for punishments, hanging and drawing was it. Reserved for the most serious crimes, usually treason, it was the legal equivalent of saying, "We're going to make very sure you regret this." The hanging part is easy enough to picture. The offender was strung up, but here's the twist. They weren't necessarily meant to die right away. In many cases, the rope was slackened before the end, ensuring the rest of the punishment could proceed. That's right, This was less quick justice and more extended performance piece. Then came the drawing part, which, despite sounding artistic, had nothing to do with sketching. It referred to being hauled, often literally dragged, to the place of execution. In some towns, the condemned was tied to a hurdle or wooden board and pulled by horses through the streets. If you thought traffic was bad today, imagine trying to get to market with that parade in the way. Why so elaborate? Treason was considered the ultimate betrayal, so the punishment needed to send a very loud message. Don't even think about it. And it worked. Not necessarily because it convinced people to stay loyal, but because the mere logistics of it were exhausting. Organising horses, ropes, carts and crowds for one person's sentence? It was basically a town festival with the world's worst theme. Of course, the spectacle drew, pun absolutely intended, huge crowds. People brought children, snacks and gossip. The event became not just about punishing the traitor, but about reinforcing loyalty, and maybe enjoying a day off work. Medieval justice loved a good teachable moment, even if it was the most uncomfortable field trip imaginable. Over time, the hanging and drawing tradition lost some of its flair as punishments became quicker and less theatrical. But in its day, it was one of the most infamous shows in town. You didn't just get punished, you got a full production. In the end, the message was clear. If you were going to betray your king, you had better be prepared for your final day to come with an audience, a parade route, and more drama than a royal wedding. Before the roar of the Colosseum and the blinding flash of sunlight on polished helmets, the Gladiator's story began in a far grimmer and quieter place. Funerals. In the 3rd century BCE, long before these fights became Rome's favourite pastime, they were solemn rites, meant to honour the dead. The Romans believed that blood had a sacred power, a force capable of appeasing restless spirits. And so, in the courtyard of a grieving aristocrat's home, 2 men might be brought forward, usually prisoners of war or condemned criminals. They were given weapons, sometimes nothing more than short swords or crude shields, and ordered to fight. The purpose wasn't entertainment, at least not officially. It was a religious offering. But as the men clashed, the gathered mourners could not help but feel a surge of grim fascination. The rhythm of blades striking shields, the cries of the wounded, the final silence when one fell. It stirred something deep in the human appetite for spectacle. Rome, as it often did, took that flicker of fascination and fanned it into an empire-sized blaze. Over the next century, funerary duels grew larger, louder, and more elaborate. By the late Republic, these private combats had spilled out of courtyards and into temporary wooden arenas erected in the forum. Nobles quickly realized that the more fighters they provided, the more the people adored them. The games became less about honoring the dead and more about winning the living. When Julius Caesar held his father's funeral games, he staged hundreds of gladiatorial bouts over several days, dazzling the crowds and cementing his popularity. The blood that once flowed for religious reasons now served a different god entirely: public approval. Rome had discovered that violence could be politicized, that the cheers of a crowd could be as valuable as legions on the battlefield. By the time the Colosseum rose from the heart of the capital, the original funerary purpose of gladiatorial combat had been all but forgotten. What remained was a spectacle that blended religion, theatre, and ruthless politics. A stage where emperors could win the loyalty of the masses with a well-timed thumbs up, and where the fate of men was decided before tens of thousands of screaming voices. To most Romans, the gladiator was a paradox, a man who lived at the bottom of society, yet whose name might echo in the streets like that of a hero. Behind the spectacle was a life built on discipline, danger, and the constant shadow of death. The majority of gladiators were not volunteers. They were prisoners of war dragged from distant provinces, condemned criminals sentenced to fight, or enslaved men purchased by Lanistai, the owners of gladiator schools known as ludi. These ludi were more like brutal training camps than places of learning, each enclosed behind high walls to keep fighters in and curious eyes out. Inside, recruits lived under strict regimens. Their days were filled with weapons drills, footwork practice, conditioning, and lectures from veteran gladiators who had survived long enough to pass on their hard-earned wisdom, often in the form of scars. Gladiators were trained in specific fighting styles, each with its own weapon set, armor, and personality. A secutor wielded a short sword and a heavy shield, stalking his opponent like a predator. A retiarius, in contrast, fought with a weighted net and trident, relying on agility and precision to trap and strike. There were heavily armoured murmillos, quick-footed thraces with curved swords, and many more, each pairing designed to create an exciting, unpredictable duel. The matchups were as much about theatre as they were about skill. Life in the ludus was harsh, but not without strange perks. Gladiators were fed better than many common labourers, given high-energy diets of barley porridge, beans, and dried fruit to build muscle. Medical care, surprisingly advanced for the time, kept fighters patched up and ready for the next bout. And while they were slaves, the most successful could earn not only fame, but also rudies, a wooden sword symbolizing freedom. Despite the chains of their status, gladiators became objects of fascination, even desire. Their physical strength, defiance of death, and constant presence in the public eye turned them into a strange form of celebrity. Some Romans cheered their favourites as if they were modern sports stars, collecting mosaics or graffiti of their likenesses. Others whispered about scandalous affairs between gladiators and noblewomen, dangerous liaisons that could ruin reputations, but seemed irresistible to those drawn to the aura of the arena. Behind every cheer from the stands, though, was the unspoken truth. A gladiator's fame lasted only as long as his luck in the arena. And luck, in Rome, was as fickle as the emperor's thumb. To the Roman people, the arena was not just a killing ground. It was the empire's grandest theatre, and the gladiators were its actors. The largest and most famous stage of all was, of course, the Colosseum, a colossal structure of stone and engineering genius that could swallow more than 50,000 spectators and still have room for vendors selling wine, honeyed nuts, and roasted chickpeas. From the moment a spectator entered, the experience was carefully designed to stir emotion. Trumpets blared, brightly painted banners fluttered. The sand of the arena gleamed under the sun, ready to drink in blood. For many Romans, this was the heart of civic life, a place where rich and poor, senator and slave, could sit shoulder to shoulder, united in the thrill of the spectacle. But nothing in the arena was accidental. Every fight, every pairing of styles, every animal released from the underground cages was chosen to create tension and drama. A nimble retiarius might be matched against a heavily armoured secutor, forcing the audience to wonder, would agility outmaneuver brute force? Would the underdog snare the predator? The best bouts told a story, complete with moments of suspense, reversal, and triumph, or tragedy. Gladiatorial games were usually part of a larger munus, a day-long festival of blood sport. The morning might open with beast hunts, venaciones, featuring exotic animals from the far reaches of the empire, lions from Africa, bears from the Alps, leopards from Anatolia. Trained hunters, or sometimes condemned criminals, faced these creatures in contests that blurred the line between bravery and suicide. Midday brought the grim spectacle of executions, where those guilty of serious crimes, or unlucky enough to anger the wrong patron, met their end in highly theatrical ways. This was the Empire's version of intermission entertainment, as bizarre as it was horrifying. Then, in the afternoon, came the main event, the gladiators. The gates would open, and fighters emerged to cheers, boos, or the chants of devoted fans. They saluted the presiding official, often the emperor himself, with the famous, if not universally spoken line, Ave Caesar, morituri te salutant. Hail Caesar, those who are about to die salute you. From that moment, the stage was theirs, and the next few minutes could decide not only their fate, but their place in Roman memory. In this theatre of sand and blood, every drop spilled was part of the performance. And for the crowd, there was no better show in the world. In Rome, the games were never just about entertainment. they were about power. An emperor who could stage a lavish spectacle wasn't just keeping the people amused, he was reinforcing the idea that he alone could give them what they craved most: bread and spectacle, panem et circenses. This simple truth made gladiatorial combat as much a political weapon as any legion on the frontier. The games were expensive. Exotic animals had to be imported, arenas maintained, fighters fed and trained, and entire crews employed to run the machinery beneath the arena floor. Only the wealthy, senators, generals, and especially emperors, could afford to put on such spectacles. And in doing so, they bought loyalty. A well-timed festival could distract from military failures, economic troubles, or political scandals. If the crowd was roaring in approval at the Colosseum, they were not shouting in protest in the Forum. Politicians used the games as campaign tools, sponsoring bouts to curry favour with the masses. Julius Caesar's father's funeral games, packed with hundreds of gladiators, weren't just a tribute. They were a calculated move to win the hearts of the people. Later, emperors like Augustus refined the art, using the arena to project an image of moral authority, control, and generosity. Yet the political blade of the games could cut both ways. A poorly organised spectacle or stingy display could turn the crowd hostile. In a city where public opinion was dangerously volatile, the cheers of the arena could turn to jeers in an instant. Emperor Commodus learned this in his own bizarre fashion. He often fought in the arena himself, a move meant to connect with the people but which instead eroded his imperial dignity in the eyes of the Senate. Still, the crowd loved the novelty, proving that in Rome, public favour often outweighed elite disapproval. The games also acted as a stage for imperial propaganda. Victories in war could be reenacted in miniature, with captured enemies forced to fight or die before the crowd. Exotic animals symbolised the reach of the empire. Even the architecture, the towering tiers, the imperial box, the intricate underground, reminded the audience that Rome's might was absolute. In the politics of Rome, blood was currency. And in the arena, that currency was spent freely, buying not only the fleeting pleasure of the masses, but the enduring power of those who ruled them. A Roman crowd didn't just come to watch men fight, they came to watch characters clash. Gladiators were trained in specific archetypes, each designed to create drama, contrast, and spectacle. It was as much casting as it was combat. The murmillo was the heavyweight of the arena, armed with a broad rectangular shield, scutum, and a short stabbing sword, gladius. He wore a crested helmet with a fish-shaped design, a nod to his name. Slow but heavily protected, he relied on strength and endurance to wear his opponent down. Facing him might be the Thraex, or Thracian, modelled after Rome's enemies from the Balkans. He carried a small square shield and a curved sword, Sika, designed to hook around an opponent's shield. His helmet sported a tall crest and often a griffin motif, making him instantly recognisable. Then there was the retiarius, the net fighter, the closest thing Rome had to a duellist from a fishing village. Bare-headed and lightly armoured, he carried a weighted net to entangle foes and a trident for the finishing blow. His speed and agility made him dangerous, but one wrong move could mean disaster against a heavier shielded opponent. His traditional rival was the secutor, designed specifically to counter him. The secutor's helmet was smooth and rounded, with tiny eye holes to prevent the net from catching, and his heavy armour allowed him to press forward relentlessly. Other types added variety to the match schedule. The hoplomachus, inspired by Greek hoplites, wielded a spear and small round shield, switching to a dagger when in close quarters. The Dimacharius fought with a sword in each hand, a whirlwind of steel. The Bestiarius faced wild animals rather than human foes, relying on speed, a spear, and sheer nerve to survive. Pairings were chosen for contrast: speed versus strength, reach versus defense, agility versus brute force. The crowd loved a good mismatch because it meant tension. Could the nimble fighter dance around the armoured juggernaut, or would he be cornered and crushed? For the gladiators, these styles were more than costumes. They defined their training, their tactics, and even their identities. A skilled fighter could build a following not just by winning, but by putting on a show that fit the personality of his archetype. In the sand of the arena, style was often as important as survival, and sometimes the crowd cared more about the former than the latter. If the arena was Rome's grand stage, the ludus, the gladiator school, was the rehearsal hall. Behind high walls and guarded gates, fighters lived, ate, and bled in preparation for their moment under the sun. Life here was a paradox, brutal in its discipline, yet carefully managed to keep fighters in peak condition. After all, a dead trainee was wasted investment. Each school was run by a lanista, part coach, part prison warden, and part businessman. The lanista purchased recruits, prisoners of war, condemned criminals, or desperate men who sold themselves into the profession for a signing bonus. Once inside, they were property, but valuable property. Their worth was measured not just in skill, but in the entertainment they could provide. The training regimen was relentless. Mornings began with weapons drills, learning the precise angles for a sword thrust, the correct way to block with a shield, the rhythm of stepping and striking. Wooden swords, heavier than real ones, were used to build muscle and endurance. Footwork was drilled until it became instinct, because a single misplaced step could be fatal in the arena. Specialists taught each fighting style. A retiarius practiced casting his net with accuracy, learning to read an opponent's movements and time the throw to perfection. A murmillo trained to close the distance quickly, smashing through an enemy's guard. Sparring was frequent, but rarely to the death. Fighters were too valuable for casual losses. Diet was surprisingly good, even by Roman standards. Gladiators were known as barley men for their high carbohydrate meals of barley porridge, beans, and dried fruit, which built mass and energy. Meat was given occasionally, but not as the main staple. The goal was strength, stamina, and a body that could absorb punishment. Medical care was advanced for the era. Physicians tended wounds with wine-soaked cloths, stitched deep cuts, and used herbal salves to speed healing. A fighter with a broken bone was not discarded. He was repaired. The ludus was not a place of mercy, but it was a place of maintenance. While the ludus forged skill, it also forged spirit. Every drill, every bruise, every shouted order prepared the gladiator not just for survival, but for performance. Because when the gates opened and the crowd roared, he wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting to make sure they remembered his name. For most Romans, the life of a gladiator seemed like an endless cycle of training and combat. But beyond the sand of the arena and the dust of the ludus, there was another side. One shaped by fame, fear, and the strange privileges of a dangerous profession. Gladiators lived in barracks within the school, their quarters Spartan but not miserable. Each shared space with fellow fighters, creating bonds like those in a soldier's unit. They trained together, ate together, and sometimes buried one another. While their freedom was gone, a successful fighter could enjoy better food, regular medical care, and the certainty of a roof over his head. Luxuries some free Romans lacked. Their status outside the ludus was complicated. Legally, they were at the bottom of society, lumped in with slaves and criminals. Socially, however, they could be celebrated like sports heroes. Children carved their names into walls, merchants sold small figurines of them, and admirers, including women of the upper classes, wrote their praises in graffiti on city streets. For some, that attention was intoxicating. For others, it was dangerous. Affairs between noblewomen and gladiators were whispered about in scandalized tones, and if discovered, could ruin reputations, or worse. When fighters weren't training, they might be marched through the streets in procession before a major game, wearing their armor and carrying their weapons for the public to admire. These parades built anticipation, letting fans pick favorites before the fights began. Some gladiators even received gifts or tips from wealthy patrons eager to see them win. Yet life outside the arena was always shadowed by risk. Injuries were common, and even a minor wound could mean a career-ending infection. A gladiator could be popular one week and dead the next. And for every fighter who dreamed of winning the rudies, the wooden sword of freedom, there were many more who would never live to hold it. Still, many embraced their notoriety. They drank in taverns where patrons begged for stories of the games. They posed for artists, their likeness captured in mosaics. They listened to the roar of the crowd even in their sleep. Because for a gladiator, fame was fleeting, but while it lasted, it could make a man feel like a god, even if Rome always remembered he was just a slave. In the arena, death was always just a heartbeat away. Every match was fought under the gaze of thousands, but one pair of eyes mattered more than any other: the emperor's. His was the ultimate authority, the hand that could grant mercy or deliver doom with a flick of the wrist. Contrary to modern legend, the thumbs up and thumbs down gestures were not quite as Hollywood imagines. Ancient sources suggest that a pollis verso, a turned thumb, likely signaled death, while a concealed or flat thumb suggested mercy. The actual gestures varied, but the principle was the same. The fate of a defeated gladiator rested on the will of the crowd and the ruler presiding over the games. When a gladiator fell, the victor stood over him, weapon poised, awaiting the decision. The crowd roared its opinion, shouting for missio, release, if the fighter had shown bravery, or demanding death if he had fought poorly, or was already disgraced. The emperor, reading the mood of the people, would signal his verdict. A spared gladiator could fight another day. A condemned one faced the final strike, his blood sinking into the sand as the crowd erupted in savage delight. For the fighters, mercy was not guaranteed, even for the skilled. Politics, personal grudges, or the need to thrill the audience could tip the scales toward death. Some emperors were notoriously merciless, seeing executions as part of the day's entertainment. Others, like Augustus, preferred to reward courage, knowing that sparing a popular fighter could strengthen their bond with the people. Death in the arena was quick, but rarely clean. A killing blow was often delivered to the throat or heart, though in the chaos of combat, it could be messy. Corpses were dragged away through the Porta Libitinaria, the gate of death, to be stripped of armour and disposed of without ceremony. The sand was raked smooth, ready for the next act. To the crowd, it was all part of the spectacle, a moment to feel the raw power of life and death held in a ruler's hand. To the gladiator, it was the final gamble. Fight with honour, entertain the mob, and hope that, just maybe, the emperor's thumb would tilt toward mercy. When the last cheers faded and the Colosseum's gates rusted shut, the gladiator did not vanish from memory. Instead, he became a symbol, one that has shifted meaning over centuries, from feared slave warrior to romanticized hero. In the Roman world, the legacy of a gladiator was immediate and tangible. Even in death, his name could be etched into stone, commemorated by fans or family. Mosaics and frescoes immortalized famous bouts, while poets and chroniclers wrote of fighters whose courage made them legends. For the masses, these men embodied ideals of bravery, endurance, and skill, even if they had entered the arena in chains. When the games finally ended in the 5th century CE, due to a combination of Christian moral opposition, economic strain, and the crumbling of imperial power, the gladiator's image began to change. No longer a living profession, he became a figure of history, myth, and, eventually, entertainment. Medieval storytellers transformed him into a chivalric knight in disguise. Renaissance scholars saw him as a link to Rome's grandeur. By the modern era, artists and filmmakers turned him into a symbol of resistance against tyranny, a rebel standing defiant in the face of overwhelming odds. The fascination has never really died. Museums display gladiator helmets, swords, and armour, their dents and scratches telling silent stories of survival and defeat. Historians reconstruct the training routines, diets, and fighting styles, trying to understand what it took to stand in that sand. And every time a film or television series depicts the arena, audiences still lean forward, caught up in the same tension that gripped Romans 2,000 years ago. Who will live? Who will die? And what will the crowd decide? Yet the legacy is not just in popular culture, it's also in language. The word gladiator still conjures the image of someone who fights, often against the odds, whether in politics, sports, or personal battles. The sand of the arena has long since turned to dust, but the idea of a lone fighter standing before a roaring crowd remains one of history's most enduring images. In the end, the gladiator's true victory was not measured in matches won or enemies slain, but in the fact that his story still survives. Fierce, blood-soaked, and unforgettable. In ancient Rome, military victory was not just measured in land gained or enemies slain, it was measured in glory. And the highest glory a Roman general could achieve was the triumph, a victory parade so lavish and so rare that many great commanders never experienced it. To the Romans, a triumph was the ultimate blend of religion, politics, and theatre, staged for the gods and the people alike. But the triumph was not granted lightly. The Senate guarded the honour as jealously as the gods guarded Olympus. A general had to meet strict requirements. The campaign must have been fought under his official command. The enemy must be a foreign power rather than rebellious Romans, and the victory must be decisive, ending the war entirely. Moreover, the army had to kill at least 5,000 enemy soldiers. Anything less was considered a minor success, not worthy of such a spectacle. Even meeting these criteria didn't guarantee the laurel crown. The Senate's approval was essential, and here politics came into play. Powerful rivals could block the honour out of envy, while allies could secure it with persuasive speeches and strategic alliances. The triumph was as much a battlefield of influence as the war itself, and a clever general knew how to fight both. Once granted, preparations began on a scale few events could match. Craftsmen painted vast panels illustrating the key battles. Carpenters built floats to carry exotic animals or elaborate recreations of captured cities. Goldsmiths and jewellers polished the treasures looted from foreign palaces until they gleamed under the Mediterranean sun. The date of the triumph was chosen carefully, often on a day sacred to Jupiter, the king of the gods, whose favour was said to rest upon the victor. Priests prepared sacrifices. Musicians rehearsed the fanfares that would echo through the city, and word spread like wildfire, drawing in visitors from miles around who didn't want to miss history in the making. By the time the morning of the triumph arrived, the entire city of Rome had been transformed. Streets were swept clean, garlands hung from balconies, incense braziers set along the route. The stage was set for a performance in which the general was both actor and living symbol of Rome's unstoppable power. A man elevated almost to godhood, if only for a single, unforgettable day. The morning of a Roman triumph began long before the sun touched the rooftops of the city. Rome awoke in a haze of incense and anticipation. This was not an ordinary day. It was a day when the city itself seemed to breathe in unison, ready to honour a man who had brought victory to the Republic or the Empire. Along the triumphal route, preparations had been completed the night before. Fresh garlands of laurel and flowers hung from balconies. Merchants along the streets shuttered their shops, not out of reluctance, but because no one would be buying bread or wine today. They would all be watching. Families claimed the best viewing spots, parents hoisting children onto shoulders, old veterans straightening their backs despite creaking joints, eager to see the familiar banners of the legions they once served under. The smell of burning frankincense and myrrh drifted on the early breeze, curling through alleyways and mingling with the aroma of roasting meats from vendors who saw an opportunity to turn celebration into profit. The chatter of the crowd carried a current of excitement. Who would be marching in chains? What treasures had been taken from the enemy? Was the general truly as glorious as rumour claimed? For the soldiers who had marched home with their commander, the morning brought a different kind of anticipation. They would finally lay down their arms in the capital, no longer as weary campaigners, but as victors, the living proof of their general's success. They polished their armour until it reflected the morning light and tied red ribbons to their weapons. Meanwhile, in the Campus Martius, the triumphator, the man of the hour, prepared himself. He dressed not as a mere mortal, but in the robes of near divinity, a purple toga embroidered with gold, a laurel crown on his head, his face painted a deep vermilion in imitation of Jupiter himself. This transformation was deliberate. Today he was not just a man. He was the embodiment of Rome's strength and favour with the gods. As the first horns blared, the city's hum swelled into a roar. All eyes turned toward the gates where the procession would begin. The streets, swept and sanctified, were ready. The crowd leaned forward, a living tide of anticipation. The triumph was not just about to start, it was about to consume the city in a wave of sound, colour, and glory. The triumph's journey was as important as the celebration itself. It wasn't simply a march through the city. It was a sacred path, carefully chosen to transform the general's victory into a gift for the gods and a story for the people. The procession began at the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, where Rome's armies traditionally mustered before going to war. Here, the triumphator gathered his troops, the spoils, and the prisoners of war. With the blare of trumpets, the column began to move, crossing into the city proper through the Porta Triumphalis. A gate opened only for these rare occasions, as if even the walls of Rome bowed to admit the victors. From there, the route wound through the city's beating heart. It passed along the Via Sacra, the Sacred Way, the most prestigious street in Rome. Every inch of it was lined with spectators, the air thick with the scent of incense and the sound of flutes, drums, and cheering voices. At certain points, priests joined the parade, chanting prayers and scattering flowers, reminding everyone that this was not just politics, but an offering to Jupiter himself. As the procession advanced, it passed by the Forum Romanum, the political centre of the city. Here, senators and magistrates watched from their marble platforms, their presence lending a formal stamp of approval to the celebration. The steps of the basilicas and temples overflowed with citizens, each straining to glimpse the treasures, the captives, and the man whose name would be remembered in the annals of Rome. Every stop along the way had symbolic weight. Passing the temples was a nod to the gods, a silent acknowledgement that without divine favour, no Roman army could prevail. Crossing the Forum was a reminder to the people and the Senate alike that Rome's political and military glory were inseparable. The route's final and most dramatic ascent was the climb to the Capitoline Hill, the spiritual high ground of Rome. There, at the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the triumph would reach its climax. The general's march was not merely to the temple. It was toward immortality in the eyes of his people and his gods. In this way, the processional route told a story with every step, from the fields of Mars where wars began, through the sacred and political heart of the city, and finally to the divine seat of Rome's greatest protector. If the triumph was a play, the spoils of war were its opening act, the first glimpse of the scale of victory. Long before the general's chariot appeared, the crowd's eyes were fixed on the endless line of wagons and porters carrying the treasures of conquest. The display was meant to dazzle and overwhelm. Great chests of gold and silver gleamed in the sun, their lids thrown open so all could see the coins, cups, and jewellery piled inside. Massive statues, torn from the temples and palaces of the defeated, were paraded upright, as if they had been brought to Rome in chains. Intricately woven carpets and tapestries swayed from poles, their foreign patterns telling silent stories of lands beyond the horizon. But the spoils were more than just riches. They were propaganda. Painted boards carried by soldiers showed vivid battle scenes. The decisive charge, the moment the enemy broke, the surrender of their leader. To those who had not fought, these paintings were like windows into distant campaigns, proof that the general's reports were no exaggeration. Exotic wonders fascinated the crowd even more than gold. Strange animals from the conquered territories were led on chains or in cages, elephants towering over the procession, leopards pacing restlessly, or brightly plumed birds squawking at the noise. These living trophies were a reminder that Rome's reach extended to the very edges of the known world. There were also symbols of the enemy's defeat. Broken weapons, captured standards, and the ceremonial regalia of foreign kings were displayed like offerings to the people. Sometimes even the gods of the conquered were brought along, statues of their deities, stripped of their sanctity, now part of Rome's growing pantheon. It was a message that Rome's gods were stronger, Rome's armies unstoppable. As the wagons rolled past, the crowd roared its approval. Children pointed at glittering treasures, old veterans nodded in respect at the banners taken from once mighty foes. Every chest of gold and every carved idol told the same story. Rome had not just defeated an enemy, it had absorbed their wealth, their culture, and their pride. By the time the last cart of plunder passed, the city was already intoxicated with the scale of the victory. And yet, the procession had only just begun. The most human part of the triumph, and perhaps the most humiliating, was about to follow. After the gleam of gold and the wonder of exotic beasts came the darkest spectacle of the triumph, the prisoners of war. No matter how glorious the spoils, it was the defeated enemy, flesh and blood, who made the victory feel real to the people of Rome. They marched in chains, their heads bowed, their fine clothing a cruel reminder of the power they once held. At the front of this grim column were the most important captives, kings, generals, and high-ranking nobles taken alive on the battlefield. They wore their richest garments, not out of dignity, but because the Romans wanted the crowd to see exactly what they had stripped from them. Not only their freedom, but their thrones. Behind them shuffled lesser captives, soldiers, officials, and even family members of the defeated leaders. Women and children were not spared the humiliation, their presence serving as a living testament to the completeness of Rome's victory. The crowd jeered, spat, and shouted insults, hurling reminders of the enemy's past arrogance. For the Roman audience, this was more than cruelty. It was justice, the visible proof that their armies had crushed those who once threatened their city. For the general, it was political theatre. The sight of foreign royalty in chains reinforced his prestige and justified the expense of the campaign. Some of these captives would be kept alive, sold into slavery, or paraded again in future games. But the highest ranking among them faced a far darker fate. Tradition dictated that, after the triumph concluded, these leaders would be executed, often in the very shadow of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Their deaths were both a sacrifice to the gods and a final punctuation mark on the war they had lost. The emotional power of this part of the procession was immense. Children in the crowd would remember the faces of the defeated for the rest of their lives, just as they would remember the triumphant figure who had brought them here. It was the clearest demonstration of Rome's message to the world: resist, and this will be your fate. And yet, after the prisoners had passed and the crowd's jeers began to fade, another sound began to rise, a roar of excitement for the moment everyone had been waiting for. The general himself was about to appear. At last, the moment the crowd had been building toward all morning arrived, the appearance of the triumphator himself. If the spoils and prisoners were the proof of victory, the general was its living embodiment. He rode in a magnificent chariot, gilded and polished until it caught the sunlight in dazzling flashes. 4 white horses drew it, their manes braided with ribbons, their harnesses decorated with gold and silver fittings. The triumphator wore a crown of laurel leaves, the ancient symbol of victory, and a toga picta, a deep purple garment embroidered with gold thread, the colour reserved for Rome's most powerful. His face was painted bright vermilion, imitating the statue of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, to emphasize that on this day he was more than mortal. He was the chosen of the gods, and yet tradition demanded a reminder of his humanity. Standing behind him in the chariot was a slave, tasked with whispering in his ear throughout the procession, "Memento mori." Remember, you are mortal. It was a sobering counterpoint to the cheers of tens of thousands, a reminder that even the most glorious victory could not conquer death. The crowd erupted in a thunderous roar as the chariot rolled past. Citizens tossed flowers into the street, their petals crushed under the horses' hooves. Trumpets blared from every corner, drowning out the shouts of the soldiers marching alongside. Children called out the general's name, and veterans saluted with the stiff pride of those who knew what such a victory cost. The triumphator acknowledged the people with measured dignity, a raised hand here, a nod there. Every gesture was calculated to project both majesty and accessibility. This was a performance as much as a parade, and the general knew that public opinion could be as decisive as any battle. Behind him, the officers who had served under his command marched in full armour, their decorations gleaming. Their presence reminded the crowd that victory was never won by one man alone, but by the discipline and courage of an entire army. As the chariot moved through the city's heart toward the Capitoline Hill, the people knew they were witnessing history. For the general, it was a day that would be carved into Rome's memory, the high point of a career, a spectacle to be retold for generations. And for the city, it was a moment to see themselves reflected in the glory of their champion. No triumph was complete without the army that had made it possible. Behind the general's chariot came rank after rank of legionaries, marching in perfect formation down Rome's crowded streets. Their armour glinted in the sunlight, shields polished until they reflected the faces of the cheering crowd. These men were not faceless soldiers today. They were the heroes who had bled, starved, and endured for the glory of Rome. Each legion carried its signa, the sacred standards topped with bronze eagles or gilded wreaths, symbols as revered as the gods themselves. The men kept their eyes forward, their steps measured, the rhythm of their march echoing like a drumbeat against the paving stones. Between the formal precision, though, there was a lighter side. Tradition allowed soldiers in the triumph to sing songs, some praising the general's courage, others poking fun at his flaws. Rome had little taste for stiff, joyless adoration. Even in victory, humour had its place. Many of the soldiers wore laurel crowns like their commander, a sign that this was their victory as much as his. Some carried small trophies from the campaign, a helmet taken from an enemy, a strange trinket from a foreign market, even a dagger still bearing the marks of battle. These personal spoils gave the crowd a more intimate connection to the distant war they were celebrating. The soldiers also played a political role. Their presence reminded the Senate, the people, and the general himself where real military power lay. Thousands of disciplined, battle-hardened men marching through the capital was both a celebration and a subtle warning. The army's loyalty could raise a man to the heights of honour or drag him down to ruin. For the men themselves, the triumph was more than just a parade. It was their moment to bask in the admiration of the city they had fought to protect. Many would retire soon after, rewarded with land or money. Others would be sent to new campaigns, their laurel crowns stored away until the next chance for glory. But for this day, they were not just soldiers. They were living symbols of Rome's strength. As their chants and laughter mingled with the music of the procession, the army brought the triumph's energy to its peak. And just ahead, the final climb to the Capitoline Hill awaited, where the gods would be honoured, prisoners judged, and victory sealed in Rome's name. The triumph's long, winding journey through Rome always ended in the same place, the Capitoline Hill, home to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. This was not just a convenient stopping point, it was the spiritual high ground of the city, the place where mortal victory was formally handed over to the gods. The final stretch was the most dramatic. The steep climb to the temple forced the chariot and soldiers to slow, the sound of the crowd echoing off the stone steps. Priests in white robes joined the procession here, swinging censers heavy with incense, the sweet smoke curling upward toward the temple's towering columns. The smell mixed with the sweat of the soldiers and the faint metallic tang of polished armour. At the top waited the great bronze doors of Jupiter's temple, flanked by massive statues. As the triumphator ascended, he stepped down from his chariot and led the way on foot, a gesture of humility before the gods. In his hands he carried a golden laurel wreath, the ultimate token of victory. Inside the temple, sacred rites began. The general laid his laurel crown and the spoils of war at the feet of Jupiter's statue, symbolically offering his triumph to Rome's chief deity. Priests chanted prayers, and the lowing of sacrificial oxen filled the air. Moments later, their blood was spilled in offering, a vivid reminder that even divine favour required a price. Meanwhile, Outside in the temple courtyard, the mood shifted. The most important enemy prisoners, kings, generals or nobles captured alive, were brought forward. For many, this was the end. Tradition demanded that they be executed on this day, their deaths marking the final and irreversible close of the war. The crowd, still caught between reverence and bloodlust, watched as Rome's justice was carried out. With the sacrifices complete and the prisoners dispatched, the triumphator emerged to thunderous cheers. The ceremony had transformed his victory from a personal achievement into an act of service to the gods and the state. The climb to Capitoline Hill was more than a physical ascent. It was a symbolic one, lifting the general's name into the realm of legend. But as the priests withdrew and the crowd began to disperse, the triumph moved into its final act, the part that would determine how history remembered both the victory and the man who won it. When the last echoes of the cheers faded and the incense smoke drifted into the evening sky, the triumph was over, but its consequences were only beginning. A Roman triumph was never just a celebration of military victory, it was a political earthquake. For the triumphator, the day could mark the peak of his career, or the start of an even steeper climb toward power. His name had been shouted by thousands, his face seen in the robes and crown of a living god, his victories displayed for all to see. This was not just glory, it was political capital. In the cutthroat world of Roman politics, such prestige could translate into elections, influence in the Senate, or even a bid for supreme authority. Yet the triumph was also dangerous. Rome admired victory, but it feared ambition. Too much glory could draw envy from fellow generals and suspicion from senators. A man who looked too much like a king, or worse, an aspiring tyrant, could find his political fortunes turn quickly. Enemies would whisper that the triumph had gone to his head, that he sought to rule Rome as he had ruled the battlefield. In a republic that prided itself on shared power, this was a dangerous perception. For the army, the triumph was both reward and farewell. Soldiers were often granted bonuses, land, or citizenship if they were foreign-born. Many retired after such a victory, their service ending in a blaze of honour. Others were reassigned to new campaigns, carrying the memory of the day and the loyalty to their general, wherever Rome sent them. The city itself also benefited. The spoils of war enriched the treasury, public games and feasts were often funded from the captured wealth, and the people's morale soared. For a few days after the triumph, Rome felt invincible. Merchants sold trinkets commemorating the victory, poets composed verses about the campaign, and children reenacted the parade in the streets with laurel leaves and wooden swords. But as the days passed, life returned to its usual rhythms. The garlands wilted, the incense burners cooled, and the Senate resumed its endless debates. The triumph, for all its grandeur, was a fleeting moment, but one that would be carved into the annals of Roman history. For the general, it was the day his name was spoken in the same breath as the gods. For Rome, it was proof once more that the world belonged to her. In the Crusader states of the Holy Land, the setting for a grand feast was as much a statement of power as the food itself. Within the thick stone walls of a fortified city like Jerusalem, Acre, or Antioch, the great hall would be transformed into a scene of controlled splendour. By day, these rooms were functional spaces where council meetings were held, and messengers delivered urgent news from the front. By night, however, they became the stage for the kind of banquets that cemented alliances, impressed visitors, and reminded everyone present of the Crusaders' authority in a land far from their European homelands. The hall itself was long and high-ceilinged, its rafters blackened from years of torch and firelight. At either side, colourful banners and standards bearing the crosses of different orders, the red cross of the Templars, the black and white of the Hospitallers, hung as visual declarations of unity and strength. The flicker of hundreds of candles reflected off polished metal goblets and plates, casting warm light across the faces of the gathered. At the centre stretched long trestle tables, each covered with heavy linen cloths. Servants moved quickly between them, adjusting benches and making sure the best silverware was set at the high table reserved for the feast's most important guests. The scents of roasting meat, spiced wine, and fresh bread drifted in from the kitchens, mingling with the tang of burning incense. Beyond the physical layout, the atmosphere was deliberately orchestrated. The feast was not simply about indulgence, it was a political and cultural performance. The arrangement of seats reinforced the hierarchy. The lord of the castle or city sat at the head table, flanked by high-ranking knights, visiting envoys, and the clergy. Lesser knights, merchants, and favoured guests filled the remaining tables, each placement a subtle statement about their standing and favour. Outside the hall, the streets were quieter, but not silent. Citizens knew something important was taking place. The glow of torchlight through arrow-slit windows, the faint sounds of music and laughter carried into the cool night. For those within, the feast marked a rare moment when the constant tension of warfare eased, replaced by the comfort of abundance and the rituals of fellowship. In such surroundings, the Crusader banquet was more than a meal. It was a demonstration of survival, adaptation, and dominance in a land where power had to be displayed as much as defended. As dusk deepened and the great hall filled with golden candlelight, the arrival of the guests became an event in itself, a carefully choreographed display of rank, alliance, and ambition. The feast was not simply an occasion to eat, it was a stage where reputations were built and political bonds quietly forged. The first to arrive were often the high-ranking nobles of the Crusader states, lords of fortresses, governors of cities, and commanders of military orders. They entered in rich cloaks trimmed with fur, their swords ceremonially sheathed but never far from hand. Heralds announced each name in ringing tones, ensuring every man's title was heard by all in the hall. Knights followed, their armour exchanged for fine tunics adorned with embroidered crosses, though some still wore their mail coifs pushed back on their shoulders, a reminder of the battles that earned them their place at the table. Alongside them came envoys from distant lands, merchants from Venice and Genoa with gold rings on their fingers, Byzantine diplomats in flowing silks, and, on rare occasions, Muslim emissaries attending under truce. Their presence at a Crusader banquet was a subtle yet powerful sign that even amidst religious war, diplomacy had its place. Clergy were ever present, from humble parish priests to high-ranking bishops, their robes heavy with embroidered detail. They moved through the hall with measured grace, offering blessings to those they passed. Their presence reminded everyone that this was not merely a celebration of earthly success, but also, at least in name, an offering of gratitude to God. Pilgrims, too, sometimes found themselves in attendance. These were travellers from Europe who had completed their long journey to the Holy Land and, by fortune or favour, been invited to witness the grandeur of Crusader hospitality. Wide-eyed, they took in the mingling of East and West, a sight far removed from the simple feasts of their villages back home. Every arrival was noted by the host, for in the Crusader world, who came, and who did not, could speak volumes. Invitations were political tools, seating arrangements, subtle negotiations. Before a single dish was served, the banquet had already begun to serve its other purpose, reinforcing the web of alliances that kept these fragile kingdoms alive. Once the last guest had taken their place, and the murmurs of greeting began to fade, attention shifted to the true centerpiece of the evening, the tables themselves. These were no mere dining surfaces. They were stages of abundance, designed to impress, intimidate, and inspire envy in equal measure. Laid end to end, the trestle tables were draped in thick linen cloths, their edges weighted by the sheer number of dishes placed upon them. Silver platters gleamed under the candlelight, each one piled high with roasted meats, lamb rubbed with eastern spices, wild boar glazed with honey, and game birds stuffed with figs and almonds. The scent of sizzling fat and warm bread, mixed with the sharper notes of imported cinnamon, cloves, and saffron, drifting like a silent invitation to indulge. Bowls of fresh olives, glistening in oil, sat beside heaps of dates and dried apricots brought by caravan from the desert's edge. Soft white cheeses, some made locally and others shipped in from Europe, were arranged alongside crusty loaves of bread still warm from the oven. Between these were smaller trays of marinated vegetables, peppers, eggplants, and onions, prepared in ways that reflected the influence of Levantine cooking. To the Crusaders, the table was also a place to show off the reach of their power. Exotic fruits like pomegranates and citrus, rare in Europe at the time, appeared not merely as food, but as trophies of their control over the trade routes. Jars of preserved lemons or sweet orange marmalade were opened for guests to taste, their bright flavours a reminder that the Holy Land was a meeting place of culinary worlds. The high table, where the host and most honoured guests sat, displayed the most lavish items. Intricate sugar sculptures shaped into castles or animals, jellied fish moulded into gleaming forms, and whole roasted peacocks, their feathers reattached for dramatic effect. These were not everyday dishes. They were theatre, meant to draw gasps and remind all present that such luxury was rare even in the courts of Europe. From the far end of the hall to the Lord's seat, the tables told a silent story. One of wealth drawn from two continents, of war and trade intertwined, and of a culture that expressed victory not only on the battlefield, but in the very act of dining. If the Crusader feast was a symphony, the spices were its music, subtle at times, bold at others, transforming familiar dishes into something entirely new. In the Holy Land, Crusaders found themselves at a crossroads of trade, where caravans from Arabia, Persia, and India brought flavours that most Europeans had never even heard of. From the east came cinnamon sticks dark as mahogany, cloves as sharp as a blade on the tongue, and fragrant nutmeg that could perfume an entire dish with a single shaving. Saffron, worth its weight in gold, tinted broths and rice a rich golden hue. Black pepper, once rare in Europe, could be used with a freer hand here, its heat cutting through the fattiness of roasted meats. Yet the Crusaders did not abandon the flavours of their homelands. Rosemary sprigs from Mediterranean gardens, thyme and sage from European herb plots, and parsley from monastery gardens found their way into nearly every dish. These familiar herbs anchored the meal in a taste of home, even as Eastern flavours layered themselves over the top. The kitchens of the Crusader states became laboratories of fusion cuisine. A lamb stew might simmer with both thyme and cinnamon, creating a fragrance both comforting and exotic. Roasted chicken could be basted with honey and lemon, a pairing known in the Levant, but a revelation to Western palates. Even humble grains like barley and rice took on new life when boiled in spiced broths instead of plain water. Spices were not just culinary tools, they were political currency. Their presence at a feast signalled wealth, control of trade, and connections with merchants across continents. A noble who could season generously was making a public statement. I have influence in both East and West. For many Crusaders, these flavours would follow them home. Returning knights and pilgrims carried not only relics and stories, but also recipes and spice samples, introducing Europe to tastes that would reshape its cuisine for centuries. In this way, the Crusader banquet was not just a celebration in the moment, it was the beginning of a culinary exchange that would outlast the kingdoms themselves. On these tables, rosemary met saffron, and garlic met cinnamon, blending worlds in every bite. And for those seated in the candlelit hall, each mouthful was a reminder that they stood at the very heart of a meeting place between two great culinary traditions. If the food at a Crusader feast was a display of power and culture, the drink was its lifeblood, fueling conversation, sealing alliances, and loosening tongues long into the night. In the Crusader states, the wine jug was as important as the sword, for hospitality without drink was unthinkable. The wine itself came from many sources. Ships from Europe carried casks of prized vintages, deep, robust reds from Bordeaux, delicate whites from the Rhineland, and the sweet wines of Cyprus or Crete. These imported bottles, expensive and limited, were reserved for the high table and the most honoured guests. Their arrival at the banquet was often met with murmurs of appreciation, as much for the wealth they represented as for their flavour. Yet the Holy Land had its own vineyards, many cultivated by monastic orders, who knew the value of good wine for both liturgy and leisure. These local vintages, lighter and more fragrant, were often infused with spices like cinnamon or cloves, turning them into warming mulled wines ideal for evening feasts. In the hotter months, wine could be cooled with snow brought from Mount Lebanon, a luxury so costly that its mere presence was a statement of power. For those not drinking wine, sweetened drinks made from pomegranate or date syrup offered a refreshing alternative, while imported mead and ale satisfied those who longed for the flavours of home. On especially lavish occasions, the tables might see sherbets or chilled fruit drinks, techniques borrowed from Arab traditions, served in polished metal goblets. But drink at these feasts was not merely for pleasure. Toasting was a ritual in itself, with goblets raised to honour the host, the saints, recent victories and important guests. Each toast was both a celebration and a political act, acknowledging loyalty and strengthening bonds. The clergy present might lead a prayer before the first sip, linking the act of drinking to divine blessing. Of course, as the night wore on, wine had its other, less pious effects. Songs grew louder, the stories of battles became grander, and laughter rolled through the hall. For a few hours, the tensions of war faded beneath the haze of shared drink. In the Crusader banquet hall, wine was more than a beverage. It was a bridge between worlds, a social glue, and a silent witness to the alliances, secrets, and promises exchanged in the glow of torchlight. Once the first courses had been served, and the wine began to loosen the stiffness of formal conversation, the Crusader feast shifted from a display of food to a celebration of spectacle. In the great hall, entertainment was not just a pleasant diversion. It was an essential part of the evening's diplomacy, a way to honour guests and remind them of the host's wealth and cultural reach. Minstrels and troubadours, many of them having travelled with the Crusader armies from Europe, took up positions along the hall. Their songs ranged from chivalric ballads recounting the deeds of knights to lighter, humorous verses meant to draw laughter from the crowd. They sang in French, Provençal, or Latin, weaving familiar melodies with new tales from the Holy Land, their voices carrying over the clatter of goblets and the crackle of the hearth fires. But the entertainment was not solely Western. The Crusader states, positioned at the crossroads of cultures, embraced Eastern performers as well. Arab musicians, skilled in the oud and the rebab, filled the air with haunting melodies that wound between the stone walls like incense smoke. Drummers kept intricate rhythms that made some guests tap their feet unconsciously, while dancers, clad in bright silks and jingling ornaments, brought a shimmer of exotic movement to the evening. Storytellers also had their place, captivating listeners with tales from the Arabian Nights or the Chanson de Roland, each adapted to the audience's mood. These performances were not just for entertainment, they were cultural exchanges, blending traditions and broadening the horizons of knights who might never have heard such music or stories at home. For the nobility, there might also be games of skill or wit between courses. Archery contests held in the courtyard by torchlight, or riddling competitions in which a wrong answer could mean forfeiting a fine goblet of wine to the challenger. Such diversions allowed guests to show off their talents or charm without the risk of the battlefield. The variety of entertainments kept the feast alive deep into the night, ensuring that no guest left without a memory to carry home. For the host, this was as important as the food itself. An evening that impressed the senses was an evening that strengthened bonds. In a land where alliances could mean survival, the echo of music and the laughter of guests could be as valuable as any fortress wall. Beneath the laughter, music, and clinking goblets, a Crusader feast was never only about pleasure. It was a political theatre, carefully staged to display wealth, cement loyalties, and subtly negotiate the future of the Crusader states. The very guest list was a statement. Invitations were extended not only to friends and allies, but sometimes to rivals, whose presence at the table underlined the host's authority. Seating arrangements spoke volumes. The closer one sat to the high table, the greater one's importance or favour. A knight moved one seat nearer to the lord might leave the feast with new confidence, and perhaps a new responsibility in the next campaign. Conversely, Being placed further down the hall could be a polite but unmistakable warning. The toasts and speeches that punctuated the evening were also tools of influence. A host might praise a visiting merchant's generosity in supplying ships, subtly encouraging further investment. A toast to a neighbouring lord's bravery could reaffirm an alliance. Even the clergy's blessings, delivered in solemn tones, reinforced the idea that political unity was both a secular necessity and a divine mandate. Diplomacy was woven into the courses themselves, offering rare spices, imported wines, or delicacies from far-off lands was more than hospitality. It was a message. I have the resources and connections to obtain what others cannot. Such gestures could sway undecided allies or impress foreign dignitaries. Not all politics at the table were open. Beneath the hum of conversation, quieter dealings took place. Two knights might slip into a side chamber to discuss land disputes. A merchant and a commander could agree on favourable trade terms. An emissary might deliver a proposal on behalf of a distant king. In this way, the banquet was a safe, public space for private negotiations. Even the entertainment could serve political ends. Songs celebrating shared victories reminded everyone of the unity forged in war, while tales warning against treachery could be a veiled caution to any guest considering betrayal. Every detail, from the seating to the spice on the meat, was part of a larger performance designed to maintain the fragile balance of power in the Holy Land. By the time the feast's final course arrived, the host's goals were often well underway. Guests left not just with full stomachs, but with alliances confirmed, grudges soothed, and obligations subtly agreed upon. In the Crusader world, a banquet could change the course of politics as surely as any battle. While Crusader banquets dazzled with food, music, and political intrigue, they were also governed by a set of rituals and customs that gave the event its structure and meaning. These traditions blended European courtly etiquette with local influences from the Holy Land, creating a hybrid culture unique to the Crusader states. The evening often began with a blessing from a high-ranking clergyman. Standing at the high table, he would raise his hands and invoke God's favour upon the gathering, thanking him for the victory, peace, or alliance that had brought everyone together. Guests, from noble knights to foreign envoys, would stand in respectful silence, their heads bowed, before the feast officially commenced. Seating followed strict rules. The lord or host sat at the centre of the high table, with the most honoured guests placed to his right and left. Men of equal rank were seated according to precedence, while lower-ranking guests filled the benches further down. This arrangement was no accident. It was a visible map of the social and political order. To be moved closer to the high table in future feasts was a sign of rising favour. Before eating, it was customary for servants to bring basins of scented water for guests to wash their hands. In a land where disease was a constant threat, this was both a practical necessity and a sign of refinement. Napkins of fine linen were provided, a luxury not always found in Europe at the time. Dishes were served in a specific order, often beginning with lighter fare like fruits, salads, and soups, followed by the heavier roasted meats and rich stews, and ending with sweet pastries, preserved fruits, and spiced wine. Between courses, short intervals allowed for entertainment or conversation, ensuring the feast was as much about socializing as it was about eating. Toasting had its own protocol. Guests rose when saluting the host, important allies, or the saints. Sometimes a communal cup was passed, symbolizing unity and shared purpose. Breaking bread together carried deep symbolic weight. In the Crusader states, it was a gesture that could seal peace between feuding parties. Even the end of the feast was marked by ritual. The clergy would offer a closing prayer, and guests might be given small tokens, a pouch of spices, a sweetmeat, or a piece of fine cloth, as a reminder of the host's generosity. These customs elevated the banquet from mere indulgence to a carefully orchestrated act of cultural and political expression. When the Crusader states eventually fell and their castles became ruins, the banquets that had once filled their halls did not vanish entirely. Their influence lingered, carried home by knights, pilgrims, and merchants who had dined in the candlelit splendour of the Holy Land. The Crusader feast left a culinary and cultural legacy that stretched far beyond its original setting. Many returning Crusaders brought with them a taste for the spices and flavors they had encountered. Cinnamon, saffron, cloves, and nutmeg began appearing more frequently in European kitchens, not just for medicinal purposes but as essential elements of fine dining. Recipes that blended Eastern and Western ingredients, lamb with dried fruits, chicken with almonds and cinnamon, slowly took root in the courts of France, England, and the Italian city-states. The customs of hospitality also evolved. The elaborate seating arrangements, the ritual of hand-washing before meals, and the structured sequence of courses found in Crusader banquets influenced how formal feasts were conducted back in Europe. Even the practice of interspersing entertainment between courses, once a hallmark of Eastern hospitality, became standard in many royal courts. Symbolically, these banquets became part of the myth of the Crusades. Chroniclers and poets described them in glowing detail, portraying them as moments when the nobility of Christendom displayed its unity, refinement, and divine favour. In reality, they had often been as much about politics and survival as about celebration. But the romantic image endured. In the Mediterranean world, the exchange was not one-sided. Eastern cooks, merchants, and entertainers who had served in Crusader households carried back Western tastes and techniques, adapting them into their own traditions. Over time, the blending of culinary ideas contributed to the rich and varied food culture that still defines the region today. Perhaps the greatest legacy of these feasts was their role as cultural bridges. At a time defined by conflict, the banquet table offered a rare space where people from opposing worlds could sit, talk, and even find common ground, if only for a night. In the laughter of guests, the shared breaking of bread, and the mingling of music from east and west, there was a fleeting glimpse of a different kind of unity. Though the Crusader castles now stand silent, their banquets live on in the traditions, recipes, and ceremonial dining customs of Europe and the Middle East, echoes of a time when feasts were as powerful as fortresses.